Let's do it. Okay, so I want this to be mostly interactive. I usually, for the last 2 years, I've given an hour-long workshop on this topic, which is just a fire hose of information. So my goal here is to try to reduce the fire hose, but still provide enough information that this is useful and hopefully really interesting. So if you have questions while I'm giving my talk, please just raise your hand, and if I'm at a good point, I'll reach out and call on you. So there's kind of a question. So first of all, I'm going to say I am not a lawyer. This is my disclaimer. It applies to everything I'm going to say for the next half hour. If you know what's good for you, you're going to ignore everything I say, and you really should not repeat any of this. And all of you probably have your own internal legal counsels. Even when I think they are wrong, they are right for you. That's my disclaimer. So given that, why are we doing this? So lawyers are there to reduce. Are there any lawyers in the room? No? Okay. Most lawyers are there to reduce risk and liability, right? That is not always in line with you being successful. That's not their job. Their job is not to make you successful. Their job is to protect the liability of the company. And even 25 years after the creation of open source, there's still substantial misunderstanding and FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt about what this all means. So the point of this talk is to give you enough information that if you're trying to do something in open source, you want to publish code, you want to use code, and someone tells you, no, you can't do that for reasons X and Y, that maybe you have just enough information to think, wait, that doesn't sound right, and dig into it further. So first, I had a bunch of people fill out the survey that I sent out with 5 questions. The first one, if you modify GNU Radio code within your company, the GPL requires you to then release that code to the public. So we got 3/4 saying that is not true, 25% saying it's true. This is indeed false. And we'll dive into the GPL specifically within the talk, but if you have GNU Radio, you're using it internally, and you do not give your GNU Radio-based code to someone outside of your company, and for purposes of the license, that includes anybody that is consulting for you. It includes across teams within a company. There's no obligation to share source to anybody. False. Question 2. If you create a GNU Radio out-of-tree module and publish it to GitHub, it must be licensed under the GPL. So GRCon19, for example, does that have to be licensed as GPL? In order to use it, you have to link it against GNU Radio, right? The answer is actually false. You do not have to license your GNU Radio out-of-tree modules as the GPL. You must license your GNU Radio out-of-tree modules with a license that is compatible with the GPL. Because the code as a standalone thing, it might not be usable without GNU Radio, but it is its own thing. So it does not become GPL licensed until someone actually uses it with GNU Radio. At that point, the GPL applies. So, and there's actually a number of GNU Radio out-of-tree modules that you'll see that, for example, are under an Apache license. That's a good question. So there is actually a list of GPL v3, which is what we are, compatible licenses on the Free Software Foundation's website and on Wikipedia, actually, which is where I would recommend going. And it'll tell you, these are the licenses that we have deemed to be compatible. And as they are the stewards of the GPL, pretty much what they say goes. And your legal counsels should, every legal counsel I've ever heard of has said, if this is what they say, I'll go with it. Good question. Question 3. If you've executed a copyright assignment for GNU Radio, and you submit that code, you then cannot use it elsewhere or under a different license. So as an example, if someone were to write a polyphase channelizer and they submit it to GNU Radio such that it gets upstreamed, are they allowed to use that polyphase channelizer code in a proprietary product separate from GNU Radio? The answer is false. Did my circle just change? Yes. Well, it's the wrong circle, but it's about the same. So 60% got this one wrong. And we'll go into this a little bit more, when you submit code to GNU Radio, you are indeed giving up ownership of that code. but you are granted back a license to do anything you want with it, including using it in proprietary products. There is no risk of submitting DSP code to GNU Radio and then not being able to use it elsewhere. Question 4. I'll get into that too. Yeah. All right, question 4. If a court rules that you have violated the GPL, it can force you to release that code, the code to your violating software. This one was really interesting to me. This circle, I grabbed this circle this morning. It's actually closer to a full 75% now. Said that this is true, that a court can force you to release source code. This is indeed false. A court cannot force you to release source code. There's actually no mechanism in US law for that to happen. That's called a specific action. And that is not a thing. What the court can force you to do is stop infringing or stop violating the license. So one of the ways you can stop violating the license is by releasing the source code, right? That's just one way. Your other option, for example, is to pay penalties for your infringement. Another option is to stop using that code, right? So the court will say, you need to stop violating. They can't force you to release source code. It just happens to be one of the ways you can come out of violation. Last question. The GPL can be used for both GNU Radio source code and FPGA HDL, such as Verilog and VHDL. So 70% said this is true. About 30% said it's false. I did not intentionally write this quiz to make every question false, but I did. The answer is false. And we're going to dive into this question in a lot more detail because yeah, I agree with what you said, and I have a slide that will go into that further. Yeah, so Robin's point is this is subject to interpretation. This view is from the stewards of the GPL and free software. There are lawyers that disagree, and has never been proven, and I'll dive into that more in a minute. So there's 3 major types of intellectual property: copyright, trademark, and patent. The one that is used for software licensing is copyright. So Mark Shuttleworth mentioned this in his keynote that the hack for open source was turning sort of copyright on its head to use it to license free software. So there's 3 fundamental license clauses you'll see in pretty much every open source license. The first is the right to do a bunch of things with it, like use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, and or sell copies of the software. That string is repeated verbatim in many, many licenses, specifically because those words have explicit meaning under US law. There's a statement of notice. So this usually says something like, if you use this software, you must preserve notice of the author, right? So you can't incorporate, even under very permissive licenses usually, you can't incorporate that software into your software and say, and not say, by the way, this other person wrote it, right? And the last one is limitation of liability, statement of no warranty. So this is like the thing that's in all caps. It looks like it's yelling at you. It's like, if you use this software and somebody dies, we're not responsible for it. This turns out to be a really big deal for an important reason. So there's 3 major categories of open source licenses. Strong copyleft, which is if you use this software, the license that this software is provided under must be the license you use for your software. Weak copyleft, which is if you use this software, oh, that's a fantastic typo. This component must maintain its license, but the rest of your software can be whatever you want, proprietary included. And then permissive. There's lots of flavors of this, but it's mostly do whatever you want. So this talk is not about why open source is good and why you should use it. I don't have an agenda of saying strong copyleft is better than permissive or vice versa. One thing I do want to point out is the word open source is not controlled. People can say such and such is open source, and there is no one that can come in and say that is not true. Despite that, open source does have a definition. It's called the open source definition. It was originally written as the Debian Free Software Guidelines and then turned into the OSD. This is maintained by the OSI. Most IP counsel will use this. People and companies that are new to open source are generally unaware of it. So what I'll say here is if someone says or uses the term open source, make sure that you guys, or your party and their party, like y'all all agree on what that is. So why does it matter? Because open source has started to show up in contracts. It shows up in statements of work. It shows up in BAAs, especially since the 2018 NDAA, Section H, which was a major effort to push DoD, for example, towards open source. Oh, that's a booth. Never mind. I thought somebody was trying to talk to me. And open source does not necessarily mean copyleft. So open source code does not necessarily mean you have to release your software, as we said. So GNU Radio is distributed under the GPL version 3. This is a strong copyleft license, which means if you build something with GNU Radio and distribute it, that thing must also be GPL v3, which requires source release upon conveyance. Conveyance is the key word here. Conveyance is the word used in the license. Conveyance is what triggers distribution of source code. So if you build a product with GNU Radio, when you convey that product to a customer, that triggers source code release. Now, so the question becomes, okay, where is the boundary between what is GPL and what is not, right? Your product probably has lots of different software in it, right? So if you distribute a product that has GNU Radio in it, for example, what source code for the other software in that product must be released, right? So this has actually not been proven in US courts. The general guideline that's recommended is anything that has shared address space in memory is considered to be the boundary. Even that, though, is confusing. So, for example, a Linux kernel module. Can you write a Linux kernel module? The Linux kernel is GPL. Can you write a Linux kernel module that's not GPL? Linus Torvalds says no. NVIDIA says yes. And that's why we have binary NVIDIA blobs. So this is still generally an open question. What's recommended usually is to consider shared address space the boundary. Copywriting your code. You automatically own the copyright. You do not even have to use this copyright line. You should. Anything you produce is automatically copyrighted. Everyone likes, by the way, adding all rights reserved to everything they produce. That phrase is meaningless. It's been meaningless since 1987. You're welcome to continue using it. No lawyer cares about it. So, copyright assignment to GNU Radio. Diving into this a little bit more. Once you assign copyright, you no longer own that code. You've given up ownership of the code. But you are granted back a license to do whatever you want, which includes sub-licensing. And sub-licensing is what allows you to then use that code in, for example, a proprietary product if you want, or any other license. I'm kind of moving quickly because I'm trying to make up time. So there's kind of a question here, right? If you find code online, can you use it? How many people have copy and pasted code from somewhere into their product? Pretty much everybody. The answer is actually no. If you've done that, you're probably infringing on somebody's copyright, with some exceptions. And I'll talk about this in a second. If by default, if you publish code on your blog, for example, and you do not have a statement of license on your blog, nobody can use, reproduce, distribute, do anything with that, because you own the copyright and you've not licensed them rights to it. Now, that is actually international. That's part of the Berne Copyright Convention. So some websites have tried to deal with this. This is GitHub's default in their FAQ. They say if you don't choose a license, that default rights apply, which means no rights. So if you're looking at a GitHub repository and there's no statement of license, you cannot use it. GitHub's terms of service allow you to still fork that repository if you want to read it under your own account, I guess. Can't actually do anything with it. Stack Overflow has taken a different approach. So if you've copy and pasted code out of Stack Overflow, you're probably okay. All code posted on Stack Overflow is by default Creative Commons attribution share alike. So that means that the snippet of code must be shared alike. technically that means you ought to be distributing snippets of code. Nobody I've ever talked to thought that really was real. The attribution piece does matter, though. So technically, if you copy and paste code out of Stack Overflow into your program, in your notices file where you say, hey, this program uses the following open source projects, you need to mention that Stack Overflow user. So does open source require assignment? The answer is no. As the prime example, the Linux kernel has more than 15,000 contributors. And many of those contributors are companies, right? Huge organizations with many, many developers within them. There is no copyright assignment for the Linux kernel, right? So the Linux kernel is owned by tens of thousands of people, right? There is no one person that owns that thing. So the reason copyright assignment happens, or the reason some organizations require copyright assignment, the first is for dual licensing business models, right? So this is what happened to MySQL, for example, where if you want to have a business model where there is an open source version of your software that's strong copyleft, and then if somebody wants to use your software in a proprietary product, right, you can dual license it and say, you can have the free version. If you use it, you have to provide your own source code to your customers, or you can pay us, and then you can keep everything private, right? That's a dual license model. You can only do that if you actually own all the code, right? Because the mechanism is copyright. So for you to own all the code, that means everyone that contributes must assign copyright to you. The other reason is for litigating infringement. This is actually why this is why GNU Radio requires assignment, because in the United States, only the copyright owner can enforce copyright infringement. So that's why free software projects that are part of the GNU umbrella typically require copyright assignment, because GNU, one of their goals is to litigate infringers. And in order to do that, they must own the copyright. This is actually not true in other countries, the biggest one being Germany, which is why Harold Velt's GPL violations work in the early 2000s was so successful, because it didn't matter if he owned the copyright or not. He could litigate against anybody who was violating GPL, regardless of whether or not it was his project. So I imagine a lot of people in here have dealt with this before, either trying to use code or produce code. There's this interesting issue with government copyright in the United States. So the goal here is anything produced by government employees is owned by the taxpayer, which means it's public domain. So if a government employee produces code, it's public domain. The problem with that is if it's public domain, remember, the mechanism for licensing is copyright. So if no copyright is held, the government, technically, cannot provide its code under a license. What are the three major clauses of licensing? The right to use, you have to provide notice, and limitation of liability. Does the government want to release code and not limit its liability? The answer is no. The government does not like doing that. So most government councils will say, you may not contribute to open source because we don't own it, therefore you can't license it, therefore somebody could use it, and then sue the US government. This has resulted in many, many years of nothing getting released. There's a lot of super interesting efforts happening now to make this better. The Army Research Labs, for example, their council has developed a really impressive vehicle for releasing code. The Defense Digital Service at the Pentagon has developed a separate vehicle. And I'm actually going to show a really cool recent example. Before I do that, though, I'll just say real quickly, this problem is not true in most other countries. A great example is all countries that are part of the Commonwealth realm, which is part of the Crown. It used to be part of the British Empire. In the UK, for example, government employees produce things that are owned by the Crown, and then the Crown can license code. So here's an example of something recent. The NSA released Ghidra, which is a reverse engineering framework, and they released it under the Apache 2.0 license. So the question immediately is, okay, how did they do that, right? And you probably can't read the text, but what they say here is, portions of this product were created by the US government and not subject to US copyright protections. Oh, I should say what's interesting about this is code produced by the US government is not subject to copyright protections in the United States because it's public domain in the United States. It actually is subject to copyright protections internationally. So the US government can protect their code internationally, but not domestically. The remaining portions are copyright their respective authors. So then they have this huge block here that says what the intent of the licensing is. They basically say, this is licensed under the Apache 2.0. By the way, it mostly doesn't apply, but we really want it to. So this actually does kind of matter. And most of the time, these sorts of things have gone to court. Intent matters, right? If you think about patent infringement, right? There's a difference between accidentally infringing on a patent and intentionally infringing on a patent. Intent tends to matter. So I was really excited about this, by the way. So Robin raised the question of patents. I thought I should have added this question to the quiz. What happens if someone gives you a license to use something, right? So they produce code, they release it under a permissive license, but they don't provide a patent license. And thus, by using that code, you are infringing upon their patents. This is a totally real situation, and realistically, it's happening all of the time. Because many commonly used licenses were written 20, 25 years ago, before the patentability of software was a thing, right? So before, who was it that tried to sue Suzy or Novell, SEO, I think, claiming they owned Linux kernel, for example? Anyways, this has turned into a huge nightmare because those old licenses do not provide express patent grants. Do they actually do they provide implied patent grants? Nobody knows. It's up to your lawyer. So new licenses provide patent grants. The GPL version 3, which is what GNU Radio uses, has an express patent grant. This means that if you upstream code into GNU Radio, for example, and that, in order to use that code, a user would necessarily infringe upon one of your patents, you automatically provide a license to that patent to every user of GNU Radio. Now, this is pretty much exists in every new license that's written. The goal of it being such that to prevent users from falling into the trap, right, of finding code and using it and then getting sued for it, and also just making it easier for people to release code that they want other people to use. So there's this thing called the Apache Patent Retaliation Clause. This is spread to other licenses as well. So the goal of this clause is if you litigate against someone for patent infringement, that your license to that code terminates. So let me give an example of how that works. Let's see. Let's take somebody yell an Apache licensed software project. I'm struggling here for. Huh? Sure. Apache. That's great. All right. So let's say you own a bunch of patents, and the Apache server happens to infringe on those patents. When you make an open source, when you release something on open source code, you're effectively making a public license statement. You say anyone in the world can come use this, right? You're providing that license to anyone under certain terms. If you litigate against someone else for infringing on your patents on the Apache software server, your license to Apache terminates. So this is really useful and works well for ubiquitous software, right? So if you're, for example, if you built your company on Apache and you've patented a bunch of things that happen to read on the Apache server, you're not going to go sue somebody for infringing on those patents because now the foundation of your company you're no longer allowed to use, right? Because that patent retaliation clause kicks in, and now you're in violation of every author of the Apache software server, and you can get sued to oblivion, right? Realistically, this doesn't always work. The prime example being Microsoft and Android. So Android is actually Apache licensed, or I think it's Apache licensed. It has a patent retaliation clause in it. Microsoft decided, hey, all of you Android, this was years ago before Microsoft was kind of cool again. They decided, hey, all of you Android handset manufacturers, Android infringes on our patents. We're going to sue you. Well, then we're like, Google was like, okay, patent retaliation clause just kicked in. You're no longer allowed to use Android. Microsoft was like, whatever. They don't care, right? They weren't using Android to begin with. So was not effective in scenarios like that. I'm going to talk quickly about licensing hardware. So there's a number of licenses specifically for hardware designs. The three most popular are Open Hardware License, the Solder Pad License, and the Tapper Open Hardware License. These map very, very clearly to hardware designs. How do these work for hardware-ish things, like FPGAs and ASIC masks? So it really depends, and this is what Robin was pointing out earlier. Most lawyers think it doesn't map all that well. It makes them uncomfortable. There's sort of accepted ways of doing this if you're going to do it. There's a GPL exception that you can add to GPL license code that makes it possible to use with these kinds of things. Open cores or LibreCores, for example, the website that hosts a whole bunch of open source FPGA cores, they use the LGPL. Depending on your internal counsel, a lot of them will say that doesn't work. Like, you're clearly expressing your intent for how this should be used and the fact that it's open source, but if it ever got taken to court, this is ambiguous. So this one is this is undecided. So, yeah, that's true. And like I said, it has never been, the boundaries of it have never been upheld in US court at all. Yep. So there's still a lot of, and to make things worse, I've never spoken with a lawyer who did not think that the GPL was not written in the most confusing way possible. Yeah, it's a complicated situation. But this is why CERN is leading a new hardware licensing effort. There's a UK IP attorney involved with this. It's called the Open Hardware License V2, OHL V2. It's currently in draft mode. It provides 3 versions, a strong copyleft, a weak copyleft, and permissive versions. The clauses are written specifically to apply to things like ASIC masks, FPGA HDL, the schematics to your hardware. So CERN, I've been involved with this effort for the last couple of years. If this is the kind of thing that you're interested in, you can use this link. You can just Google CERN OHL V2. Give us feedback. The goal is to have this certified within the next year or so and have people start using it. And so hopefully we have a way to produce FPGA code and ASIC masks within SDRs with an open source licensing mechanism that everyone agrees on works. And with that, we are 15 minutes overdue for lunch. It actually is lunchtime now, right? Yes? Okay. So I'm not going to take questions. You can come talk to me later if you want. We have announcements. So the first one is please hang up your posters if you have a poster here. The poster session is open in lunches and PM breaks for the next couple days. What are my other ones? Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Ben.